Hello everybody, I am Jarrett Ross, a GeneaVlogger, and on today's vlog, we will be looking into Mr. Beat's Volga German ancestry. Today we're going to shift our focus to Mr. Beat's great-grandmother, who was born Estella Marie Schmidt. Now, we actually started talking about this branch of the family in episode 2 because this is one of the branches that we found through DNA. And in episode 3, we go much further into it and actually built out some of the tree. But now we're actually going to dive into the story of the Schmidt family. Now, here we have the page that we've built for Estella Marie Schmidt. We see that she was born September 29th, 1904 in Catherine, Kansas, and passed away September 1st, 1999 in Sharon, Kansas. So I imagine Mr. Beat may have met her in his lifetime. Now, she was one of many siblings, which we can see here that we added previously when we were doing the DNA. And her parents had a lot of siblings as well, and it was a really large family. So now we're going to take a look at Estella in the tree to take a look at the family because it is so large. Now, we built out Eugene's siblings. We did not build out Mary's siblings yet. Eugene being Estella's father and Mary being Estella's mother. Now, Estella was born in Kansas, but when we look at Eugene, we see that he was actually born in Russia in a town called Katharinenstadt. So looking at his profile, let's see if we can get an idea of when he did come over to the United States. So he was born in 1875, and when we scroll down, what we find is that his first census is actually 1880. So clicking on this, we see that he was 5, birth date 1875, born in the USSR, home Catherine, Ellis County in Kansas, dwelling number 8. We see that he's the grandson of the head of household. His father's name is John and his mother's name is Catherine. And then here we see the household. It's a very large household. But when we take a look at the actual census, notice that there's only 6 pages. And that's because Catherine is just a small town. So here we have the Schmidt family, and we see Jacob Schmidt, Maria, their son Cornelius, their son John, their daughter-in-law Catherine, which if you look, it says daughter, but then it says in-law underneath. And we know that John and Catherine are Eugene's parents. We see Eugene is 5. Then he has a brother, John Jr., who's 2. And then Andreas, his wife, Emily, and then their children. But something that I have experience with in researching in my own family is a small community. And sometimes doing small community research and focusing on the community beyond just your family, in a sense, you may actually find more about your family. So looking at this 1880 census, when we actually go to the first page, we actually see, well, look, there's Carlin. And what was Eugene's wife's name? Carlin. So we see that same family name, and when we even scroll up, we see there's 2 households of Carlins. So when we zoom out, we kind of look through, we notice the names Corner, Walter. I'm not sure what that says. I think Leeler, but then we see Bissing. We go to the next page where we have the Schmidts. We see Bissing, Schmidt, Staub, Schultz, Weitz, Leenum, Weilert, and then go to the next page. And basically just going through, you kind of see the community. We have Mice, Weilert, Ubert, Miller, Staub, Toller, Staub. So we see a lot of these same family names over and over. We see a lot of these Staubs. We have more Carlins. Here we have what looks like Giebler or Gubler. We have another Schmidt family. We have another Carlin family. And there was one more thing that I found really interesting when looking at the census. Back to this page here, when we look at who was the enumerator, we'll notice the last name Carlin. So more than likely, the person doing the enumeration for the Catherine Township was part of that family and is one of Mr. Beats' relatives. Now, because Catherine was a small town, I figured I might as well see, can I find anything about the town specifically? And boy, could I. Just by doing a little bit of Google searching and sometimes even social media searching, like on Facebook or Twitter, it helped turn up all sorts of stuff for me. One thing I found was this website, volgagerman.net, which is run by the American Historical Society of Germans from Russia, also known as the AHSGR. I also found that the Ellis County Historical Society, which Catherine is in Ellis County, had all sorts of documentation and information on the township of Catherine. Some really interesting things they actually have model houses of the entire town of Catherine, which were built by a Schmidt. And then I found a genealogical book called The Founding Families of Catherine, Kansas. And that book's author, Sean McGinnis, actually ran a Facebook page. And here we have that page, and just scrolling down, we can see once we get to some of the names, Weilert, well, do we remember the Weilert name in the 1880 census? Bolig, I don't think I quite remember that name. But then we get down here and we see Lycum. We see that that's within the Weilert family. We see there's Carlin. We see that Goit's name. And once I found that page, I sent him a message and we were able to soon connect.
Sean McGinnis. I born and raised in Hayes, Kansas, Volga German, half Volga German, but both Volga German ethnically. Started doing genealogy with my grandmother when I was about 13. So that's about 40 years ago. So I've been doing genealogy for a while.
Now, one thing that Sean was able to explain was the story behind the Volga Germans, because I don't really know a whole lot about Volga Germans. And when I found that they were called Volga Germans, but they were from Russia, it was like, well, what are Germans doing in Russia? What's the story here?
Well, it comes from the Volga River. And so they went and settled the steppes along the Volga River. And therefore they became known as Volga Germans. Catherine the Great, who was a German princess, decided that she wanted to settle the steppes that were uncivilized, uninhabited, and she sent out a decree, I'm thinking it's 1763, asking anyone in Europe, primarily in central, around Germany, if they wanted to come and have religious freedom, free land, and exemption from military service. As they had just come out of the 7 Years' War, and there were a lot of religious tensions, a lot of people, I think 27,000 people left. Most of them were German, although there were some French, there were some British, there were Dutch, I think there were even maybe some Swedes, but there were not, we call them Volga Germans, but they weren't all necessarily 100% German. The Katharinenstadt was a large city. It's now called Markstadt, or I'm not even sure what it's called now after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. But it's a big city, and the Germans were only a part of it. I think one of the things that's interesting to me is they stayed German. Marrying very little into Russia. I don't have very few marriages into Russian families until late 19th century. There is a couple, but it was really, they stayed German, they married German, and they stayed in their communities and wanted to stay that way.
But the benefits that Sean mentioned didn't last forever, and Sean explained that as these benefits of living in Russia began to dissipate, these Volga Germans started to look to move elsewhere.
Russian monarchy, started rescinding the things that they had moved there for. They were now no longer exempt from the military, and they started controlling the religious practices. They would send agents to the churches and kind of started surveying them, and they felt the change of the winds. And so many of them started leaving. Around 1870 is really the start of the big push. The Catherine people all came in about 1875, 1876. They all came at one time, and they chose Catherine because they sent a scouting party of 5 members to go to various places in America, which of course at that time was kind of doing the same thing Catherine was, come to the Midwest, we'll give you free land. And so they were, but America wasn't the only country doing that. Argentina was doing that. Brazil was doing that. And so they sent out search parties. And of all the places they went to, they felt that the Ellis County area resembled the most their Volga home. They knew that. I think they knew it was coming. And of course, the truth is, I mean, it took a while, but 1941, the Russian government made them, because it was wartime and they were Germans. They made them outlaws, and they shipped them all to Siberia. So first they starved them to death, and then they shipped them all to Russia. So the winds were not in their favor, and so I think they felt it was time to get out and to refine the freedoms that they were continuing to enjoy, but were losing.
Now, earlier I mentioned that I had found VolgaGerman.net, and they had a page all about Catherine. So here we have that page about Catherine, and it gives a lot of information on the town. Now here we can see that it actually gives us the story. Catherine is a small community of approximately 89 to 90 residents located in north central Ellis County. The town was established on April 8th, 1876, but a group of German immigrants had moved from Katharinenstadt, Russia. These early settlers of Ellis County were part of the same group of Germans who had lived along the Volga River in Russia from 1764 to 1875. Now, jumping ahead in this explanation, we actually get a little bit about their journey. So their journey from Katharinenstadt, Russia took them through Saratov, which is a big city near Katharinenstadt, to Berlin, Bremen, and then they sailed to Baltimore. They arrived in Topeka, Kansas on November 8th, 1875, where they spent the winter and worked. The 1st of March, they arrived in Hayes County for about a month. They went back and forth by horse and buggy from Hayes to build their new town site and homes. This original group of settlers was made up of approximately 7 families, and in July, September, and November 1876, additional families arrived in Catherine. Now, you've been able to study this really in depth because it's such a small amount of families, and so you've kind of been able to study them, I guess, in a sense, as a community instead of just studying the family.
I did, but I didn't start out doing that. I probably did it like everybody else is. Who's my parents, and who are their parents, and who are their parents, and you find you know their name, and then you find their birth act, and then you find who their parents are, and then you look for their parents. You just do your direct branch. Well, as I was doing that in Catherine, my grandfather is a Stab, and he was born there. I did that, and then I would do like, who are the brothers and sisters too. So, but as you're doing that, then they would marry a Carline, and this one married a Carline, and that one married a Carline. Well, were they sisters? Were they cousins? What? And so it started bringing up this question. I kept coming across all of them, and kind of realized that there weren't so many. I just decided to do all of it. And when I did all of it, then I could kind of see how all the pieces fit, and that how the families were intermarrying. And then if somebody married somebody, was that really their sister? Well, yes, it was their sister, because here's her birth record, and here's her parents, etc. It actually made it way more easy to understand from my family point of view. I could figure out exactly how they fit into their community, and the fact that Catherine is a bit unusual in that 28 families came and settled, and then basically only married between themselves for the first 30 years probably, and then they only married out to other Volga German communities, and then probably about 1910, 1915, 1920, then they started marrying Americans and diverse, moving to Hayes, which was the bigger town next door. 28 was doable. It was actually easier to just do all of them and record every birth than it was to go, well, this one I want, and that one I don't want, and this one I want, and that one I don't want. It was strangely more information, but easier to digest and easier to handle.
Now, on the left here, we can actually see the founding families of Catherine. So the early founding families, we have the Bissings, Carlins, and the Coiners, which we recognize those names from the 1880 census. Then on June 24th, 1876, a second group left Katharinenstadt, Russia, for Ellis County, arriving in Hayes on July 26th, and moving to Catherine the following day. Now, this includes Johannes and Agnes Carlin, Carl and Margaretha Coiner, Anna Katharina Mice. Now, all these names underneath, those are their children. Now, remember, Eugene was born in Russia, so we should find him listed here. And we certainly do. We see Johannes and Katharina Schmidt and their two children, Eugenius and Aloysius. But if we remember, in the 1880 census, there was Eugene and his brother John Jr. So who is Aloysius? So when we go back to Eugene's page and we look at his siblings, we see Aloysius Schmidt, born September 8th, 1874, died August 18th, 1876. Now remember, they arrived in July of 1876. So within a month of arriving, their 2-year-old son, Aloysius, died. So when we actually look at the hints, we see photos of Aloysius's grave, and these are actually typical markers in the Catherine Cemetery. But when we take a look at the Find a Grave, we can see immigrated July 29th, 1876, as we know, and we can take a closer look at that photo. Alois Schmidt, Geb, which means birth, 1874, 8th of September, and then he died 18th of August, 1876. So this must have been a really tough time for the family, because not only is moving a really stressful thing, especially imagine moving back then halfway across the world, even moving now halfway across the world. If someone from Russia were to try to move to Kansas, it's not an easy thing. And then within a month of arriving, having your son, your 2-year-old son, die, that must have been extremely difficult. Now, as I conducted my research into Mr. Beat's family, there was one family member from this side that really stood out to me. And looking back at that family tree on Ancestry, scrolling up, it's actually Johann's father, Jacob Schmidt. And so I asked Sean if he could tell me a little bit more about Jacob, who seemed to be quite a central figure in Catherine. Someone that stood out when I was looking at Mr. Beat's tree was his ancestor, Jacob Schmidt, who, I hope I say this right, was known as Der Schulmeister.
Pretty good. I would say you nailed it.
So if you could talk about him, because he seemed to be a pretty interesting character within the community.
There were apparently only six of any of the first settlers or any of the first inhabitants of Catherine, Kansas, that wrote anything. And he wrote the most. So he kept a diary for about 60 years. It was primarily his finances, but it also had any births that occurred in the family or any of their godchildren, including their godchildren in Russia. So up until the 1980s, 90s, there was nothing that came out of Russia. In fact, my grandmother said they burned all the records. There are no records. And so his book was a look back into Russia when we didn't have one, of relationships and, his godchildren and his brothers and sisters and his family tree that was extremely rare. Now we can pretty much find all the church records. So it's a different story, but he was an important person. He was a school teacher. He was educated, godfather to a lot of children. He was an important member of the Catherine community. I did dig this out and find this. This is the copy of Father Blaine's annotated copy of his family album. So it's the text and then his commentary, which the commentary is very rich. It provides a lot of context and a lot of and for the interview I reread it, and it didn't really have any stories. I mean, it didn't have stories in it. It's pretty factual.
I decided to send him the pedigree for Mr. Beat and his branch of the family in Catherine, and asked him, are there any other ancestors of Mr. Beat's that stand out to you? And then he mentioned this.
Schmidt, Salzman, Matz. Matz was another, Marion Matz was another soldier in Napoleon's army who was captured and sent to the colonies, or chose to go to the colonies, as my Shuvi ancestor was.
That was actually quite surprising to hear, and we didn't really discuss it further. Sean had mentioned his own ancestor, who was also a soldier of Napoleon, but I figured I really want to look into Marion Mott's. What's going on here? Now, Marion Mott's was actually Jacob Schmidt's father-in-law. Jacob Schmidt married Anna Mott's, and her father was Marion. So looking back at the family tree here, when we look at Anna Motz's branch, we do see Marion Mott's, and then we see her mother was Dorothy Ubert. Now, if we remember, that Ubert name was in the 1880 census as well. So it kind of comes all together, like what Sean said, where everybody really is connected. And as you go further back, you find even more connections. But looking at Marion Mott's, we see that he was born in 1789 in Nancy, France, which is in Lorraine. And we see that he died in Katharinenstadt. Now, Ancestry really does not have anything other than other family trees. So I decided to dive a bit deeper into the research on Marion. Now, this ended up leading me to a page called norkarussia.info. And this is about a town called Norka in Russia, which is a Volga German colony. So it was a town just like Katharinenstadt. And one of these pages discusses Napoleon's soldiers who were resettled in Volga German colonies. And we can start this story with Napoleon's invasion of Russia on June 24th, 1812. Marion was one of over 400,000 soldiers and staff who were part of this invasion into Russia. The Russians who were retreating burned everything so that the advancing army of Napoleon had few rations to find. On September 7th, there was the Battle of Borodino, which caused terrible losses on both sides. And then September 14th, Napoleon arrived in Moscow expecting to find supplies and all sorts of stuff, but instead found an almost completely empty city. And then the next morning, after arriving in Moscow, fires were starting to burn all over the place, which were set by Russian patriots. Napoleon expected the Russian army to surrender, but they never did, and he kept waiting and waiting until he finally had to try to retreat because they didn't have enough supplies to support the army. But as they tried to retreat, then they started having to deal with the Russian winter. And that's one of the things I think that's most well known about Napoleon's invasion of Russia is that things didn't go well for Napoleon because he underestimated the Russian winter. But somewhere in the chaos of Napoleon's invasion, Marion was captured. Now, Marion would be one of exactly 181 Napoleonic soldiers who were resettled in Volga German colonies. When we scroll down to the bottom, we actually see these sources are quite useful. So the first one we see here, prisoners of war of Napoleon's army in the Volga region, the arrangement, content, relationships with the local population. Bulletin of the Samara State University, and this is in Samara, Russia. So when we click this, this actually takes us to a page which is in Russian, but we can use our Google Translate, and then we get a really in-depth story about how the prisoners of war from Napoleon's army interacted and were treated by the local populations in these Volga German colonies. When we go back to that page, we also see down here list of Napoleon's 181 soldiers who were resettled. And we zoom in, and this is the actual list of all 181. So when we scroll down to 110, we see Motz, Matz, Marn, Marin, Margen. So I think they couldn't quite say what it was saying, but this is Marion Matz. And we see Ekaterinenstadt. So if anyone understands Cyrillic, you're probably reading right along with me. But this is number 110 right here. And all the way over on the right, these are actually quite recognizable to anyone who does genealogy because these are file locations. Now, I tried to actually get a hold of these records. I was unable to. I'm not familiar with a lot of the Russian sites. There are Russian archive websites. I tried reaching out to some of my buddies who know Cyrillic, but unfortunately, no one was able to help me out. But that would be something that we could look into. And it's very possibly something that Sean McGinnis has already looked into. But speaking of Sean, Sean actually had one more really interesting thing to talk about with one of the families that actually he and Mr. Beat share, and that's the Carlin family.
The Carlins were actually Carolins, and they were from Holland. They were not German.
That's interesting about the Carlins. Can you say what's the pronunciation?
Well, as you know, doing any research, how something is spelled, people think that really means something. I really don't think it means something. It's how the priest thought it sounded like, or how somebody thought it was spelled, and the level of education of the priest or the rabbi, or whoever was writing it, whatever level they were, or whether they knew the community or didn't know the community. You can get any kind of spelling you want. I've never found one family in any history that has a fixed spelling. It gets fixed later. It's this is it now. This is the way we spell it, and it's in America this is the way it's written. But in any historical document, so saying that is it's written from the Russian into German, or from it's written Carolin, Carolin, and they were definitely from Holland. They were from Amsterdam. From Holland is an interesting story, because what I do know about them is they were all in there were two or three main departure points, and Lindheim was one of them, and the Schmidts were not far from there, maybe 15 miles from there. So they were kind of near the hub of transport for Volga Germans leaving for Russia. My guess is the Carolins or the Carlins would have gone to Germany, and from Germany gone. I mean, the centralized points for leaving were in Germany, but a lot of them were they got in their cart and drove there. And then once they were there, they were on boats. They would go up the North Sea, and they would usually winter on arrival on the coast, and then go down to the Volga from the north. The trip took about a year.
Now, as I mentioned, I actually found Sean because he wrote a book about the founding families of Catherine, Kansas. So I asked him if he could tell me a little bit about making the book.
As we said earlier in the discussion, I started doing my family, and then I realized that they were all kind of interrelated with these other families. So I just did all of them. And then when I did all of them, I realized I had this huge file and book of information that I thought was fascinating. And I thought, why don't I make this available to other people? If you're a genealogist, you think it's interesting to everyone. Of course, genealogy is not interesting to everyone, as you soon find out. But people who are not just genealogists and genealogy nerds are at a certain point interested in that. Even if they're young, maybe not. But later you realize that people they lose their parents, and then they realize, well, I should have asked them and I didn't. And how are we related to that family? I know we are, but how are we? And so I thought, well, if I have all this information, other people will definitely be able to use this information. Why don't I publish it? Well, I think it took me 18 months to turn the raw information I had and data into something that you could publish. In the meantime, Russia kind of opened up, and the archives opened up, and we suddenly had access to all the information in Russia, which was then a fascinating addition to 28 families moved from Katharinenstadt, Germany, Russia, to Catherine, Kansas, found a village. You can tell, okay, this is a family in there. These people have the same last name, and these are brothers and sisters, and you could see their obvious relationships with the people came over. Well, in opening at Russia and seeing the archives and the birth information and the marriage information in Russia, suddenly you realized, well, those two are cousins, and their mothers are sisters, and their grandmother. You see that these families were not inbred, but interrelated and connected, and stayed connected for the century from the time they settled in Russia till the time they moved to Kansas. There was already extensive relationship. Let me tell you an anecdotal story. Afghanistan, two guys, a guy and a woman, were there, and they talking about background, and they realized that they both had the same family name, and they looked up. They had a copy of my book, and they found out that they were related and how they related, and they were serving together in Afghanistan. I love that story.
Now, Sean actually sent me a full digitized copy of the book, so I'll be able to share that with Mr. Beat, and he and his family will have extensive knowledge all about this side. And I really want to show a couple of pieces here because he made such interesting charts and he goes in such depth with certain things. And we even discussed that a little bit on our call.
In my book, the thing I'm probably the most proud of is the charts, which were hand done. There's no computer program that can do those. I tried to get, if I could, the family on one page. Some of them are so big you can't, and so they stretch on several pages. But the part of the original settlers and their relationship to each other in Russia, and the central block of that information is on a page. And sometimes it's really dense, and I'm not even sure you could read it. But I really like the idea of having something that somebody could just print out and put on the wall. Or those charts were meant to make it visual, that you could just see, oh, look here, and then this is my, and then they're from page 20, here's the Carlines, now we'll go over to page, we'll flip over this page, oh, well, now look how they're related, which took a lot of work trying to get it all on there. But anyway, that's probably something I'm the most proud of.
Well, thank you everybody for following along for this YouTuber family tree series, diving into the family tree of Mr. Beat. We will be coming back in a few months with the next season, which is going to be focusing on Matt Baker from Useful Charts. Well, thank you so much for checking out this video. I do hope that you enjoyed. If you did, please be sure to give it a thumbs up. It really does help me out. If you'd like to get access to my content early or even get access to exclusive content, you can do so by becoming a patron of mine on Patreon. And not only will you get all of that fun access, but you'll also be helping in supporting the channel. If you'd like to subscribe, you just have to click right about here. It is completely free to do so. You can also follow me on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram at GeneaVlogger. I'm the GeneaVlogger. I will see you in my next video.